So hello there and welcome to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 Podcast, a show where we take all of the latest news, gossip and events in the world of Formula One and we relay that back to you for your listening or viewing pleasure, depending on which platform you choose to follow us on. And the summer is here, guys, and vibes are very much positive in the UK at the moment where we're based. Of course, Euro 2020 is well underway. And of course, if you are following one of the home nations teams, I'm sure you'll have reasons to be cheerful, perhaps some more than others. But of course, the F1 season is very much in full swing now. We're 6 races into the season, plenty of talking points that have happened already and plenty more I'm sure we're going to be discussing over the next few weeks with a huge triple header coming up, the first of which we will be looking into the preview for the French Grand Prix at Paul Ricard. And joining us on this episode for the very first time, it's Tom from the Monkey Seat Podcast. Tom, first of all, thank you so much for coming on the DNF1 F1 Podcast. How are you this evening?
My pleasure. Big fan of the podcast. Been listening to it the last couple of months and really enjoying it. So just thank you for having me on. It's great to collaborate with some fellow podcasters. So that's great. I am fine. I'm a little bit sunburned. I've got to be honest. I don't look it on my camera, but my back is like a lobster. So I've been sleeping with wet towels on my back and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, it's nice to actually be in weather where we can get sunburned. So
absolutely. Clearly, the fact
you only need a couple of hours, didn't you, in the UK? 2 hours. That's it. Sunburn.
Yeah,
no, that's it.
Walk outside and straight away you can smell the sizzle of burning flesh.
I'm just imagining that. If you are listening to this in 4D, you can now smell that one. But yeah, no, I mean, the factor 50 is clearly needed these days more than some in some countries. Clearly in the UK, that's just usually the default, really. But, you know, as said, I'm sure the background that you've got there, Tom, looks a lot better than what you've just described. So I think we're going to persevere with that for the time being. But of course, if you are not familiar with Tom's podcast, the Monkey Seat Podcast, they discuss all things Formula One. And of course, if you are partial to other motor racing series like IndyCar, for example, which clearly anyone who's listened to this pod will know that we are not, definitely check Tom and the Monkey Seat Podcast out for more great stuff on there. And of course, joining me on this episode, as always, is my co-host, Courtney Pine. Courtney, how are you doing this evening? You okay?
Yeah, hello, everyone. Can't complain. Got my COVID jab today, so apart from an achy arm, yeah, things could be worse.
Absolutely. So Courtney is all chipped and ready to go then. I've got mine coming up. I've got mine coming up at the end of the week as well. So no spoilers.
My phone signal is so much better now I've had my first jab. That's brilliant.
I've been hearing some weird rumours, people saying you can hear stocks and shares, sort of like the Matrix appearing in front of your eyes and everything else. I think someone's got to do one for F1, like the F1 telemetry, like they have on F1 TV. You can now switch something on your ear and it just all comes up.
Adam, the amount of data that you get from practice sessions, I reckon you had the jab a while ago.
Well, they did have a patient 0, so you know everyone's got to have one. But that's enough about vaccines. Of course, I'm sure people don't want to tune into that. But so the French Grand Prix preview, and I mean the best place I suppose that we can begin is at the very front of the field, and of course reeling off the back of his first win for Red Bull, Sergio Perez, who seems to have really given the F1 field and Red Bull plenty of reasons to be positive as this summer starts to shape up. Now, Tom, I'm going to come to you first on this one because a lot of people have been asking questions regarding Sergio Perez's form for the start of the season. And would you say it's fair that perhaps his current performance in the first 6 races has been inflated, perhaps beyond where it should be, given he's just won the Baku Grand Prix a couple of weeks ago?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at his performances over the course of the season, he started probably a little slower than he would have wanted to. But when you break it down, he's actually done better than anyone else previously in that car. And even when you take down the performance differential as well, this year's car is easier to drive seemingly and also much higher performance. But even so, he's been pound for pound closer to Max Verstappen than any previous teammate. Took him 2 or 3 races to really start to get on the back end of him, but he's shown flashes in the weekends where he hasn't been on Max's pace. He's shown flashes where he looked like he may have been on the pace of Verstappen at times. His race pace in the first race was the same as Verstappen's, despite being in the midfield. And I think he's done a sterling job so far. to be honest, the fact that he's only won the race because the top two have dropped out is probably does him a little bit of disservice, because he was right there, and had he been the lead driver in that team, he may well have won the race anyway. You know, that the Red Bull pit strategy to bring him in when one more lap and he would have overcut Verstappen. I'm absolutely certain of that. I mean, without the slow pit stop, potentially not, but even so, he had the pace to win that race besides a botch stop, regardless. So I think he is exceeding the expectations of the Red Bull team, definitely. And I mean, I've never been his biggest fan, to be honest, but certainly from last year's performances, I became more of a Checo fan, and this year he's definitely proved me wrong on my previous preconceptions of his talent. So, no, I think he's done good.
Yeah, no, it's really well put, actually, I should say. You mentioned, of course, Gasly and Alex Albon over the last 2 seasons not having as much of the rub of the green as Sergio Perez. And a lot of people, myself included, feel that he has already exceeded the standard that those two put together for different reasons. I mean, you can argue that Pierre Gasly tried to change the car too much to suit his driving style. And obviously Red Bull weren't really happy with that. And they just felt that he was never able to come to terms with it. Perhaps he wasn't ready for it. And then you also had Alex Albon that tried to meet the standards of the car, but ultimately just wasn't good enough at this point in time. In the case of Checo Perez, of course, we've got to put the caveat that the Red Bull car is much more competitive than it has been the last 2 seasons. But at the same time, I think we should also acknowledge that Max Verstappen is arguably a better driver than he has been over the last 2 seasons. I mean, he's been fantastic last season in terms of consistency, but he's certainly upped his game another level, and Checo's had to match that. So when you weigh all of that up, Tom, if you were the Red Bull boss right now, if you were Christian Horner or Dr. Helmut Marko, would you already be looking to potentially offering Perez a new deal at Red Bull? Or do you feel that perhaps he needs to do just a little bit more similar to what he did in Baku to get that contract?
No, I think they'll be very, very happy with what they've seen from him so far. I think it's maybe a little too early to say for certain, because you never know how people perform when the pressure's not on. Maybe give him till the summer break and then sit down and thrash it out then. But I think it would be a no-brainer, absolute no-brainer to renew his contract, because I think when you're saying about Verstappen race this game, absolutely, but also in previous years, Verstappen has had nothing to lose, so he's been all out for the win, and that's why he's been getting these box office results, from nowhere. I was saying last year, thank God for Max Verstappen, because no one else is anywhere near him. I think this year he's got more to lose, so potentially you could say that Perez is closer to him, a slightly more conservative Max Verstappen. I mean, you look at the way he was running his race in Baku. If that had been another team where in the position that Perez was in, he could well have jumped him, and Verstappen was probably managing his pace at that point, and he could well have ended up losing the race lead for that in a much more championship thinking conservative Max Verstappen way. I have no doubt that aggression is still in there, but he's just trying to do the Hamilton approach of playing the long game, and it definitely seems to be working for him so far, bar the obviously the wheel issue which I'm sure we'll get onto later on in Baku. But yeah, no, so to answer your question is, I think it is a no-brainer, but I don't think they will do it. I don't think they'll do it yet. I think they'll wait a little bit longer yet, but in their mind, I think Checo Perez is their first choice for next season now, and that I'm not sure what that means for Alex Albon and his future, as I think in their minds they thought bring Perez in for a year and then bring Albon back, a better driver, but Perez exceeding expectations and will probably only get better. I think that could be bad news for Albon, because I can't even see him getting back into AlphaTauri with the news about the Alpine contracts today as well.
I know, absolutely. Of course, there's so many ins and outs and rumour mills on. Silly season seems to be starting earlier and earlier with every season now. And of course, as you mentioned, we will get onto the news at Alpine in due course. But Courtney, I want to bring you into this discussion as well, because you and I recorded a podcast recently regarding Sergio Perez and obviously what he's done this season and how we feel his performance has been, of course, including that performance in Baku, but more importantly, not including that, because of course you don't want to overstate a season's performance so far on the basis of one race. Now, I suppose the question we didn't really answer with Sergio Perez is what has been the key attributes that he has showcased so far in his time at Red Bull that has impressed them so much, contrary to what Albon and Gasly ultimately failed to do?
I'll say the most noticeable thing is that he's been calm and collective, something that Albon and Gasly have definitely lacked. Maybe that sort of behaviour comes with age. I'm sure it does. But the fact that he didn't panic, given the sort of slow start that he had, he's just even in this like 2-3 races, you've seen the turnaround in his form. He didn't panic. He hasn't been making high-profile mistakes that we saw from Gasly and Albon when they had slow starts to their times at Red Bull. But we've seen this maturity, and I think it's a good attribute for Red Bull to have, considering that Max is still relatively young, and I just feel that the two sort of different driving styles actually come together quite well to develop like the perfect package within this team, and it's showing given the position that Red Bull are in the Constructors' Championship.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And of course, that'll be something Red Bull hope will continue, at least from their second driver. I'm certainly sure they have no reservations over the number one at this point in time. But getting on to Max Verstappen, as I feel like we probably should, the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, as we saw in Monaco, showcased a lot of qualities in Max that perhaps a lot of people, myself included, felt that he needed to put together more in his racecraft. That ability to lead from the front, control the race, manage it in the way that we've seen Lewis Hamilton do so many times in his Formula One career. Now Max finds himself in a position where that is going to be something he will be able to do more so than not. And ultimately, it was very unfortunate for him in the fact that it ended with that huge tyre blowout. Thankfully, he was okay. Of course, the controversy that followed that, which we'll get into. But an incident like that, even though ultimately it hasn't cost him any points in the championship to Lewis Hamilton, which of course will be the forefront of Max's mind, there was a big opportunity to stretch that gap at a circuit where Red Bull probably felt a lot more comfortable than Mercedes. Tom, first of all, do you feel Max is ultimately going to be too bothered about the Azerbaijan retirement, knowing that his championship lead did not diminish? And in addition to that, do you feel mentally he can, G himself up again to go into this French Grand Prix not bothered by the fact that he lost points from a race he should have won and just carry on with the momentum that he's been showing so far this season?
I think he'll compartmentalize it for now, but certainly towards the end of the season, if it's getting tight for points, it will weigh on his mind. If you come to like the last few races and there's not a lot of points in it, then definitely he'll be thinking, God, if only that tyre hadn't gone in Baku. But as it is, it's given that his failure happened first, he would have been absolutely despondent and angry and wanted answers. And then seeing Hamilton not getting points as well, that would have been a huge relief to him. So I think out of the two, he would be the more happy coming away from the racetrack. So I think he'll see it as an overall negative, but it will be damage limitation. Even though that there was no points change. Obviously, he's lost points to a teammate. He's lost points in the Constructors' Championship for his team. But I think he'll see it as an overall small negative as opposed to a massive negative that he would have been thinking of at the time. So yeah, it's just moving on to France now, and whether he can or whether Red Bull can match the Mercedes, because I'm a little in two minds as to what's going to happen. I certainly think if the Red Bull is on par with the Mercedes at this track, then that puts them as favourite for the season, because that's shown them quicker on pretty much every type of circuit that there is now, apart from Barcelona, which does share some traits with France, to be fair. But say if they're quicker than Mercedes here, then that's ominous for Mercedes, and they've got some serious work to do.
Yeah, absolutely right. And of course, we're going to find out all the answers regarding this track and obviously how the Red Bull car handles. Courtney, do you share those thoughts with Tom on Max Verstappen, how he's going to deal with this mentally after somewhat missing out in extending his lead, but ultimately still able to go again, knowing that he's leading the World Championship?
I think it would have been a completely different story had Lewis picked up, second or even possibly first in that race, because that would have made a big shift in the championship battle. It would have been a lot more difficult for Max to catch up, obviously, given the maths. But yeah, I think on the flip side, in theory, Mercedes should be faster in these coming races. So if Red Bull find themselves behind Lewis in particular after you come to like Silverstone, then there will be a lot of regret, given that the track specifics of Monaco and Baku were obviously always going to suit Red Bull. So if we go down towards the end of the season and Max is, a certain amount of points behind Lewis, he will be looking at that thinking, that was our chance, given, that was our strong circuit. And we literally blew it in the most important moments. So it all depends on how Red Bull perform in these coming races.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I think that's going to be critical, this triple header, because Mercedes, of course, have looked very strong at the Austrian circuit. We're going to be going there twice, of course, for the Styrian race first and then the Austrian Grand Prix. It seems that the Mercedes ultimately has the advantage in the high-speed corners and some of the mid-speed corners as well. They're not too far between them, whereas the Red Bull seems to be a much more nimble car and stable in the lower-speed corners, which, of course, will become a problem for them at a circuit like the Castellet in France this weekend. We all seem to be agreed that this weekend is going to be quite pivotal towards which direction this championship could go. But in terms of the actual Drivers' Championship, I want to kind of try and sum this up mentally from Max Verstappen's perspective, is that he currently leads the championship to Hamilton. Of course, he had that huge let-off in Azerbaijan. And in the past, we've seen drivers like Sebastian Vettel, Nico Rosberg, even Bottas to some degree, at times lead the championship. And of course, eventually they seem to fade away to the point where Lewis reels them in. And then at that point, he's uncatchable. Do you feel that for Max Verstappen to win this world championship, he's going to need to maintain that lead ahead of Hamilton all the way through? Or do you feel that he can recover at any point if Lewis does take the lead back in the championship? Tom, I'm going to ask you that one first.
Sure. I think it's... Max Verstappen is like someone that Hamilton has never had to face before in his championship battles. Rosberg was a completely different animal, and Bottas has never really been in the fight. His best season for Mercedes so far has been 2017, and he was nowhere near him then. And now he's just got further and further away. Vettel was, you can say what you want about Vettel. He seemed to have his best years behind him and just didn't really suit the Ferrari operation. So there were occasions when Ferrari should have won the championship, and between a mixture of Ferrari and Vettel threw it away. So he's never had a competitor like Max Verstappen to fight against. Now, I'm not saying that means Verstappen's definitely going to win, but I do think there's going to be they're going to be exchanging blows all season. There's going to be one person will have a bad race, the other one will pick up points. Now they'll just be going tit for tat. Wins here, there. I mean, it's 3-2 at the moment for wins. I think 3 to Hamilton, 2 for Verstappen. But then obviously Hamilton not being in the points has put Verstappen in the lead. So you couldn't. There's only 4 points between them, but that may as well be 1 point or nothing. There's literally nothing between them at the moment. So I think it's going to be blow for blow all season. I don't think anyone's going to be particularly worried about building up a big lead and then Hamilton coming strong in the second half of the season like he normally does. I think that's more Hamilton doing what Hamilton does in the second half of the season and just the other drivers falling away. I don't think Verstappen will do that. He tends to come on strong in the second half of the season as well, but he's just never been in a championship fight before. So I think it's going to be very even all the way through. And as I said, it's normally Verstappen as well that's climbing up the championship order in the second half of the season. So I don't think we've got anything to worry about for that. I think we're in for a cracking season.
It's funny because as you're saying that, I agree with every bit, but I'm imagining sort of like Lewis chasing Max as he did in Hungary a few years ago and the Spanish Grand Prix this season, and you've got the Jaws theme in the background, and it's sort of getting more intense bit by bit, going dun 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 dun. And it's almost like, at what point is Max going to either crack or handle this? Because of course we've seen where the strategy's not worked out for Max, but we've not equally seen Max in a position where he's going to come under the pressure he's going to face eventually at some point later this season. So that will be very telling how he's able to cope with it, contrary to how we would have imagined he would have dealt with it a few years ago, which of course probably wouldn't have been much different to Vettel and Rosberg before eventually he won that world title. Courtney, I'm going to throw this one at you as well. How do you see this going down with Max? Do you feel that if Lewis does overtake him in the championship again, that Max can recover? Or do you feel that it might be too much for him to sort of overcome at this point?
Yeah, I'm going to follow on from the point you just made about how Max handles the pressure. There's no doubt how talented Max is, and he's, in terms of raw talent, he's more than capable of winning his championship. Like, his pace is fierce, let's be honest here. But I feel that Lewis has the mental edge, given not only the experiences that he clearly has, but also given the fact that I do feel that Lewis has the least to lose, given that really deep down, does Lewis have anything to really prove to himself or the general audience? Because he's pretty much achieved everything he can in Formula One. In terms of stats, he's the best of all time. So I think he obviously, no one likes to lose, but I just feel that Lewis has a lot less to lose because Max will want to stake his claim in Formula One, and he will be desperate to overthrow somebody of Lewis's stature given his long-term reputation in the sport, because I do feel that once Lewis retires, I do think life could be a lot easier for Max. So once Max retires and you look back in his career, he could win multiple world championships. If he doesn't beat Lewis, there will always be that question mark over his ability overall once his career's over.
And that's absolutely right. I mean, you could make that argument about Sebastian Vettel to a degree. You know, he's won 4 world titles, won over 50 Grand Prix, one of the best drivers of all time. But the one reason why they won't consider him up against the absolute all-time greats of all time is because he never beat Lewis in equal machinery, if you think about it. Some people can make their arguments to the contrary if they like. I mean, I rate Sebastian very highly, but as you mentioned, Courtney, that is the important factor for Max Verstappen, that this could be the best opportunity to beat Lewis. And if he doesn't take it, it may sour any future achievements that he makes when you weigh it all up. Let's get into the controversy, of course, with the tyres. We mentioned that we were going to talk about it. Of course, we're not going to go into too much depth on this one. I don't think we really need to have a blown out discussion on tyres, as much as everyone would love to listen to that. But Pirelli, of course, investigating the aftermath of the 2 tyre blowouts, one to Max Verstappen, and of course, the same happening to Lance Stroll earlier in the race for Aston Martin. And I kind of expected this to come out, but as they mentioned in this statement, they haven't blamed debris. They haven't blamed the quality of the tyres. So naturally, you'd have thought, well, okay, well, which one is it? But they basically have put it down to by implying that Red Bull and Aston Martin, at certain points in the race, without any evidence to prove this, were running their tyres either under pressures or not at the temperatures that they should have been, to the point where when those loads were exerted onto the cars, the tyres would have been more likely to delaminate and have caused the failures that they did. Now, in layman's terms, it basically means that they believe, without actually stating this, that Red Bull and Aston Martin weren't running the tyres to the pressures that they should have been. I'll be honest with you guys, I find that really strange, especially when there's no evidence to prove that. Tom, what do you make of Pirelli's statement? Do you feel like they've just done an investigation on themselves and felt that, well, we've done nothing wrong, so we'll just imply it's someone else's fault and hope it moves on? I mean, it didn't really give us any definitive answers.
Yeah, I have to confess, I've only read part of the statement. I haven't read I've read the report on the statement from Sky Sports, I believe it was. I haven't actually read the Pirelli statement as it was verbatim. But from the tone that I got from the statement was more that Pirelli have said that the tyres are unlikely to have been caused by debris, and the conditions that the tyres were subjected to during the race caused the failure. But they have said that the temperatures of the blankets and the pressures used by Red Bull and Aston Martin were correct into the guidance. So unless they're saying that something else has happened during the race, that where they've changed the pressures or in the pit stops they've ramped up the temperature of the blankets or something, I don't know. But certainly the impression that I got from the snippet of the article I read was that they were actually more pointing blame towards themselves, which I didn't expect. I expected them to say that it was debris, because that's what Pirelli do. But in this case, certainly the impression I got was more that they were going to look into it further and look at what more needs to be done. And Red Bull said that they will continue to operate under the guidance of Pirelli. So I'm not sure what to make of it. I think it's going to go on and on. I think there's going to be a lot of finger pointing and a lot of mudslinging. But at the moment, they're just all kind of jockeying for position and saying, well, we don't know who's to blame yet, but it certainly isn't us. And all 3 parties are saying that. So I think it's just going to go on and on.
Yeah, I mean, it's really confusing. I mean, you're right to point out that Pirelli did say that before the start of the race, when of course the checks are done, Red Bull and Aston Martin did run their tyres under the right temperatures, under blankets, and at the right pressures. The big ambiguity, which I think Pirelli are kind of leaning onto, is the fact that there's no monitoring or no checks done during the race that we can tell that actually, let us know if Red Bull and Aston Martin in this case are deliberately running their tyres during the race at lower pressures in order to, as a result of what's happened. Now, for those of you wondering why would teams do that, the simple way of putting it is that teams try to run pressures lower, as low as they possibly can, to maximize the contact patch with the tyres to the racetrack, which of course increases grip. And of course, they're able to put more load and energy into the tyres, which increases performance. Now, Pirelli at the Baku Grand Prix actually raised the tolerances for the tire pressures, meaning that they obviously were aware of these issues and they obviously advised the teams on how far they could stretch these harder tires. But in Max and Lance Stroll's case, they were well within that, and they still had these failures, which of course cost them a lot of points, a lot of damage as well to their cars, and certainly shook the drivers up. Courtney, on this subject as well, it seems that Pirelli, as we've just talked about with Tom, they kind of said pass the buck, but also at the same time raised another question to this that perhaps we'll only get answers to later on in the season. Do you feel that this is something that's going to stretch throughout the season if we have other incidents? I'm thinking Silverstone in last season where we had something similar. Do you feel that this could happen again and stretch out, or do you feel that everyone will just accept it and move on with it?
Well, there needs to be an answer because, you're risking not only, having a big impact on the championship, but then also putting the safety of the drivers or even sometimes the spectators at risk. Because you think about the speed that Max was going at when he had that blowout, on a street circuit as well. It shouldn't be happening, plain and simple. But I mentioned this before when we went through this topic in a previous episode. Pirelli have always had this problem between getting the balance right between the safety, which should be paramount, and making tyres that keep the race entertaining, because they've been guilty of making tyres that are too soft that have obviously led to these kind of blowouts. But then they've also, when they've been cautious and making the tyres too hard, you're seeing races that have very little strategic mix in it because the tyres are so hard, and they, you could go on the set of tyres pretty much the whole race. So it's always been a dilemma that Pirelli have had, that they've never really, because they've been providing tyres in Formula One for a while, and it seems like they've never quite got that balance right, even after all these years.
I mean, it is quite concerning because these tyres are obviously much beefier than they were last season. Some of the tolerances have changed, but it seems that more needs to be done. Of course, Pirelli and the FIA are now implementing measures at the French Grand Prix to perhaps monitor these tyre pressure changes throughout the race as well they can. And, in other circumstances, try and see if they can enforce the teams to be a bit more cautious with how they handle the blankets. For example, I think at the Spanish Grand Prix, Lewis pointed this out, that Red Bull, after the checks were done on the tyres before they actually went out and did their runs, they remove the tire blankets a little bit earlier to kind of relieve the pressures a bit, to give them a bit of extra performance. Now, of course, that's not illegal, but it's something perhaps the FIA may decide to introduce in order to improve safety, given the circumstances that we have. Because the last thing we want to see, as you mentioned, Courtney, is a big accident happening and a driver suffering injuries or worse as a result of a tire blowout, especially on a circuit like Azerbaijan at the speeds Max would have been traveling at. But yeah.
Do you want to hear my take on it?
Go for it, Tom.
I think ban tyre blankets. You don't have them in F2, you don't have them in F3, you don't have them in IndyCar, and the racing is so much better for it. The drivers have got to generate temperature into their own tyres themselves. They've got cold tyres on the grid. The formation lap at the moment is pointless because they leave the grid with their cars in perfect condition to start a race, and they drive around for a lap trying to keep the car in that condition ready to start the race. You take away the tyre blankets, and that formation lap is actually becomes a strategic part of the race. And again, you come out of pit stops, drivers come out of pit stops a second and a half, 2 seconds in front of the guy, and then they've got 4 or 5 corners before they can get temperature in the tyres and be able to defend. And, just coming out slightly ahead out of the pit box is not going to guarantee that you've got the overtake done. You've then got to fight to defend. So I think just get rid of tyre blankets altogether. I don't see the point in them.
Yeah, I honestly don't know why either. I mean, they did talk about this last season as something they were going to incorporate perhaps for 2022 when they homologated the rules back a year. But for whatever reason, they don't seem to be going ahead with this. I mean, I'm not an expert on tyres. I'd have to try and speak to someone from Pirelli if they'd ever come on this podcast to try and understand why the FIA have not decided to do that. That would be a fun podcast to listen to. But as I said, yeah, it's something to increase the action a little bit. And as you mentioned, Tom, it does spice up things in F2, particularly in the races, of course, when they make their pit stop. It does take a good couple of laps to warm up the tyres, which, of course, can create opportunities for overtaking if teams strategize efficiently enough. But enough about tyres and Red Bull. Let's move on to Mercedes. And this is a big weekend for Mercedes. I've said in the last couple of episodes that Mercedes are very quickly finding themselves in a position that they've never really found themselves in since they returned to Formula One in 2010, especially in the turbo hybrid era. And right now we're hearing a lot of comments from Toto Wolff regarding what Mercedes want to do with their current car, and some backlash of certain comments that Christian Horner has made and everything else to really rile them up. And at the moment, it seems that Mercedes are looking for answers, but at the moment aren't really finding them. Contrary to how efficient they've been at always being able to find a response at the earliest opportunity. This season, however, it doesn't seem to be the case. We can extend that further, if you like, to what has been going on with the drivers. Valtteri Bottas, of course, we'll talk about in a moment. But let's get on to Lewis Hamilton. And despite his amazing start to the season, the best that he had had after the first 4 races, in Monaco and in Baku, by and large, it's certainly not been Lewis Hamilton-esque. There's been more issues to him. But could you say, Courtney, that this could be a huge weekend for Lewis Hamilton in terms of trying to turn the tide to his season? And more importantly, do you think he can pull it off?
Well, with a championship charge, a lot of it comes down to momentum. And clearly Lewis and Mercedes as a team need that. We've already discussed the track-specific thing. I think Mercedes always expected to struggle in Monaco in particular. So, as you said, we're going into a good amount of races now where Mercedes should be there or thereabouts to win these races. So if they don't do well here and or in Austria, I think the pressure is going to be massively on the team, because they are the team to beat. They are the team with everything to lose at this stage, given how dominant they've been. So it's going to be a big weekend, I'd say, not only for Lewis Hamilton, Mercedes as a team, but it's a massive weekend for Valtteri Bottas as well, because I feel that his F1 career is sort of hanging on a thread right now.
And Tom, we as you would have known from discussions in the past, Lewis Hamilton has usually been very much iron in his defenses. He's been very good at adapting to awkward situations, and of course, in most cases, getting the best out of a bad situation. He very nearly did that in Baku. Very nearly, I wouldn't say stole, but very nearly won the race in a position that he probably never expected to find himself in. Ultimately made a very rare mistake with the magic button, if you like, on the brakes, which of course caused him to go off at turn 1. Would you say it's fair to point out that perhaps this is the first time that Lewis perhaps is starting to feel some real pressure, which is causing these mistakes, not just from Max Verstappen, but the whole situation at Mercedes at the moment?
I think in the past he's made mistakes, but we just never noticed them because the minor mistakes he's been making have cost him a second and a half of a 15-second lead, as opposed to losing 5 positions or going off the track in Imola and ending up a lap down. So I think it's he's still the machine that he's used to being. I think he'll take solace from the fact that the 2 races we've had here since it came back on the calendar, he's won, and he's won unchallenged as well. It's a slight help from Vettel taking his teammate out in 2018, I want to say.
That's right, yeah.
But yeah, apart from that, he still has had no real challenge at this track. So he's obviously very comfortable with this track. So I think, given his record here and Mercedes' record here as well, even before the pre-war days as well, they won here quite a few times. Not in Paul Ricard, but at the French Grand Prix, they've got a very good record. So I think they want to keep that going. I think Hamilton himself is he is definitely under pressure. I think his mistakes are just being a bit more highlighted than they would normally be. I mean, it was only a few races ago he was talking about how Red Bull are making too many mistakes, and since then, he's made one almighty mistake, and Mercedes have failed to turn up to a Grand Prix. So I think if Mercedes are going to carry on with the trend that they normally do and have 1 or 2 bad weekends a year, then he's probably got a bumper season of points still to come. But if Mercedes have dropped off in any way, which is possible, every empire falls eventually, I can see that if that is happening now, then Hamilton's going to be the one hanging on to that car and trying to drag it across the line. And I think he's definitely up for that fight. We've seen him do it before. He dragged a McLaren into the championship fights in I think 2 seasons where he had no real right being in the championship fight. He was in the championship fight with a couple of races to go. Took it to the last race in 2010 when that car was nowhere near championship ready. He won a race in 2009 when that car was an absolute dog. Could have won two because should have won in Abu Dhabi as well had it not been for another McLaren failure. So he's always good at pulling out results in bad cars. Bottas, on the other hand, is not. He was never able to get good results in an average Williams, and then when a Williams became good in 2014, he was still, he led a race and was unable to convert it. I think I agree with Courtney about his F1 career hanging by a thread. I genuinely think if Mercedes don't retain him, nobody of any significance is going to want him, and he's just going to pack up and leave F1, because I don't think, people say about, it'll just be a straight swap back to Williams. I can't see him going back to Williams. That's just going to destroy him, especially where Williams are now. I think he would sooner leave Formula One than go to another team that isn't competitive. And now that obviously the Alpine window is closed, certainly for a year, that I'm not sure where else he could really go. The only other place potentially would be Red Bull.
Yeah, and Red Bull have also mentioned that door could potentially be already closed to him as well, if what Dr. Helmut Marko has been saying recently, although Dr. Helmut's always good for a quote and he's never shy of giving an opinion, whether that be appreciated or not by the F1 community is less to be said on that one. But you're right to point this out. I think, there's a few things that I've observed in this battle between Hamilton in particular and Max Verstappen, one of which is Hamilton seems to be very vocal on a lot of things that are going on at Red Bull, a lot of things going on with Max. And by contrary, Max has been very blunt with his answers or just thrown it back and said, they need to worry about what they're doing. Do you feel that is the reality of what's going on, Courtney? Or do you feel that perhaps, Lewis is just playing the game as he's done so much in the past with his rivals, and that eventually it will take its toll on the opposition? Or do you feel perhaps he just needs to just, suck it up and get on with it, really?
I think right now it's easy for Max and Red Bull to be calm because, first of all, we are still fairly early into the season. So the pressure is still pretty low on them at this point. But if we go later on in the season, we've already said about, how it'd be interesting to see how Max reacts. If they are still in that tight battle at the end of the season, I think that's when we're really going to see the pressure ramp up on Red Bull and Max. And it will be very interesting to see how they react to it, given that Mercedes have been here so many times in the recent seasons. And I think that could be pivotal. And that's why these coming races are going to be massive for this championship, because if Mercedes are close to Red Bull at the end of the season, I feel that experience, not only from the team, but from Lewis as well, could be the difference when it comes to deciding this championship. On the flip side, I think Sergio Perez is going to play a massive part in this Constructors' Championship. And as I said in the last episode, I think Perez could be the difference in the outcome of the Constructors' Championship for certain.
Yeah, and that's a good point to make. Of course, we did talk about that in our last episode. You've both been very vocal already on Valtteri Bottas and what's going on in his mind this season, and perhaps where it could be going next season, if at all, if he stays in Formula One or not, depending on what happens with his future. But we've already said how critical Perez could be to Red Bull this season. How critical could Valtteri Bottas turn out to be to Mercedes this season? Let's not worry about next season. Of course, there have been loads of rumours intensifying about George Russell. Some have gone as far as saying that he may be announced at the British Grand Prix. Now, personally, I think that'd be a stupid idea, as much as I want to see George in that car, because it would completely derail Mercedes championship, at least as far as Bottas is concerned in it, because he loses the motivation. But with all of those noises going on in the background, and Tom, I'll ask you this one first. Do you feel that Valtteri at the moment is just driving for the sake of honouring his contract, or do you feel that he's completely lost all confidence in his abilities? Because right now, you'd have to say that, given that some people said half the grid could do a better job than Bottas in this car, the way he's driving at the moment, they're probably right.
I think that's a little harsh. I mean, I don't think that Bottas is a world championship driver, but I think that he's as I said before, he's never really been close to Hamilton ever, and he's still not close to Hamilton. But the problem is he's not particularly much worse than he normally is against Hamilton. It's just the rest of the pack is so much closer, and this is part of the argument I was having. I was actually a big Gasly defender when Albon was in the car for Red Bull, saying that they're saying, Albon's doing so much better than Gasly. So no, the second half of the season, now Red Bull was a lot better, a lot more competitive. He was still the same distance behind Verstappen as Gasly was. It's just position-wise, he was much higher up the field because the car was better. And in the complete opposite, in this situation, Bottas is still just as far behind Hamilton as he normally is. It's just he's got more cars between them because the rest of the field have closed back in, which is the reason, is part of the reason why Hamilton is so good. And with Perez in that team, that's pushing Red Bull further forward as well, given that they've now got a second driver in that fight, something that Mercedes have had the luxury of not having to worry about for a couple of seasons now. So Bottas, he will be under huge pressure. His job is not to challenge Hamilton in the same way that Perez's job is not to challenge Verstappen. His competitiveness as a professional, he will still believe that he is the greatest driver of all time, because they all do. Even the idiot at the back believes he's the greatest driver of all time. So, if they didn't believe that, then they wouldn't be in Formula One. And I think this is why I think that if Bottas doesn't get a contract renewal, then he will just leave Formula One. But in answer to your question, he is hugely important to Mercedes, because I think he could potentially cost them the Constructors' Championship. And by I mean cost them, I mean more Perez wins Red Bull the Constructors' Championship. But Bottas needs to up his game. He needs to get closer and needs to be much more all or nothing, elbows out, because he's never been like that. I don't recall ever seeing Bottas pull off an aggressive but fair overtake and get the job done. All the times I've seen him do it, they've all been under DRS or with a massive performance advantage, or he's got it wrong. A couple of collisions with Raikkonen over the years as well, which is why they don't particularly like each other. So he's hugely important, and he needs to up his game. He needs to up his competitiveness in wheel-to-wheel racing, and he needs to start bagging some good positions from Red Bull and not worry about crashing. He needs to get alongside Perez, get ahead of him, or bin it. That's what he needs to do, to be honest. Not take him out, but he needs to put more risk into it and get the risk versus reward, because at the moment he's got the ratio completely wrong. And as a result, he's sixth in the championship. Was he 22 points behind Perez or something like that? Which is, given that Perez had a mediocre start to the season, he's behind a Ferrari and a McLaren. That's not good enough in the car has been the quickest car on the grid this season at times, and is still at least the second quickest car. He should be fourth at least, and I think he will end up in fourth in the championship, but he's currently still 19 points behind, 19 points behind Lando Norris, which is just not good enough. So he does need to get better in that wheel-to-wheel racing.
No, and you're absolutely right. And of course, as harsh as my previous comments were, I think what you've basically just summed up there, Tom, is kind of the issue Mercedes are having with Bottas, because with the exclusion of Monaco, Bottas he's been there or thereabouts, but when Mercedes have really needed him to get a result or at least get something, he's languishing down at the latter ends of the midfield. We saw in Imola how he struggled there before his crash with Russell. We saw in Baku, he was struggling to get into the midfield. And of course, that really poor restart that he had, where he lost so many places. You look at that if you're at Mercedes and think, right now, you'd start to have real doubts over, is this going to be the guy that should be in your car? I mean, forget next season. I'm pretty sure there are probably a few people that are wondering whether or not they should promote Russell sooner, as ludicrous as that sounds. But other teams have done it. And you certainly couldn't rule it out if this form continues. Courtney, to wrap this, yes.
Yeah, so can I just mention one more thing? And that's the characteristics of this year's Mercedes. I'll keep it brief.
Sure.
It's given, despite Mercedes' sort of deficit in pure pace compared to how they usually are, it does seem that this Mercedes doesn't struggle with overtakes as much. And I'd like to go back to Imola as the perfect reference of the differences we're seeing between Lewis and Valtteri. When Lewis slipped off the track, he went on a great charge, as we saw. Well, probably like one of his best drivers in recent times. We know that Mercedes is capable of overtaking. Yet we saw Valtteri Bottas struggling, ending up having that collision with George Russell. Let's not forget George Russell was about to overtake him when that incident took place. And we're seeing that Valtteri just seems almost unable to overtake. When we're seeing that with Lewis's car, that car is more than capable of been able to overtake. And I don't know. I said this before. I think Valtteri already knows something. His driving is that of a dejected man. I think he knows he's going to lose that seat. And I think we've already seen signs of an half-assed driver, to be honest.
Yeah, very could well be. It's certainly there. The voices are certainly, the rumours are certainly going around. How much there is to actually report on realistically, we don't know, of course, how much that's affecting Bottas. I'd be surprised if it wasn't completely affecting him, but it certainly is showing at the moment in his performances. Right, let's move on to the battle of the best of the rest, McLaren versus Ferrari. And, it's been so back and forth this season between those two teams, and there's only 2 points separating them in the Constructors' Championship. Lando Norris and Charles Leclerc, very much respectively for McLaren and Ferrari, the shining stars in this team. Tom, how do you see the battle going this weekend? Do you feel that Ferrari will maintain the advantages that at the moment they seem to have, at least in qualifying, or do you feel that perhaps McLaren will start to be a factor once again, as they were in the early stages of the season?
I think the Ferraris have proved themselves to be dynamite qualifiers, with Leclerc especially. Sainz is getting there. He's certainly he's certainly doing very well in that Ferrari. So, and to only be 10 points behind Leclerc is brilliant. I think they're going to be there or thereabouts in qualifying with McLaren. I don't think they'll be pushing for pole position anymore. That's very unlikely. I think that was more just circuit specific situations and good lucky toes at the right times in Baku to allow them to kind of out-qualify the car. And that's part of Charles Leclerc's abilities to get the car into positions where it isn't necessarily has any right being. So I think they'll be there or thereabouts with McLaren. McLaren will have the race pace. I think the key thing for McLaren is Daniel Ricciardo, and can he get back into that fight, because he's shown shoots of recovery. Barcelona was a good race for him. Monaco was horrendous, and Baku better, but still not there. He wasn't up to his Spain levels, so he needs to get on top of it soon. I think he's got a couple of tracks coming up that he knows really well and has raced well on in the past. Not had any particular good luck in the past here at Paul Ricard. I think he finished 11th after qualifying 8th last time out, so he's not particularly that's in a Renault though, so slightly different situation. But I think he's that's the key for McLaren really. Their race pace is great. They've got a good racer in Lando Norris and a sleeping giant in Ricciardo, but I think Ferrari have just got the edge on drivers at the moment, so it's down to what they can extract from that car on the Sundays. I think my gut is, as much as I hate to say, anyone who knows me knows that I'm a huge McLaren fan. I think it's likely to be Ferrari that are going to be there at the end of the season, which is painful because I predicted they'd be there at the start of the season, but then they kind of looked like they weren't going to be, and they teased me, and then McLaren looked so good, and now Ferrari seem to have got it together a little bit. So let's see, because it's 2 races and it's 2 outliers. So and now that Singapore's off the calendar as well, that's one potential Ferrari bumper result gone. So I think it's on a knife edge, and it all depends on Daniel Ricciardo, and can he match Carlos Sainz to keep McLaren in that fight.
Yeah, and I think it's important to, I've often acknowledged the progress that Ferrari have made this season. Particularly, they seem to have exceeded expectations a little bit. Whether people realistically felt they could return to the front of the midfield is up for debate, but there's certainly no debate over to how good they are at the moment. If you can sum up how Ferrari have made these games, or what's impressed you the most, whether it be the improvements they've made to the car, given the limited changes they could make under the regulations, the improvements to engines, or perhaps even the performance of Carlos Sainz, contrary to other number 2 drivers. What has impressed you the most with Ferrari this season compared to where they were last season, Tom?
I think getting Vettel out of that team, he just wasn't in the right place there. So clearly, Sainz coming in, and he's the hardest working driver they've ever had. That's a quote from them, and I believe that even includes Michael Schumacher, which is phenomenal. He's only had 1 race where he's finished outside the points, and that was Portugal. Charles Leclerc has been in the points in every race, apart from the race that he didn't start when he was on pole and probably would have won it. So it's that consistency that's done it. I mean, they've got a bit more grunt from the engine, which always helps. I'm not particularly impressed with what they've done with the engine. I'm just impressed that they haven't cheated anymore, allegedly cheated anymore. So it's more, Yeah, I think that nothing's really impressed me with Ferrari, to be honest. It's more that they've gone for Sainz. I think, to be honest, they went for Sainz because they thought he'd be an easy number 2 for Leclerc. And then after Sainz's performance last year, we're thinking, oh, we might have a bit of a problem here, lads. But as it is, he's shown that he's a match for Leclerc. I think Leclerc's still got a slight edge on him. Obviously, he's got the experience with the team as well, and he is the golden boy. Subconsciously, they are going to back him over Sainz. He's also got a longer contract than Sainz. So, but I think he's there for the long term, and really, it's how well he's integrated himself into that team, and that's what's propelled Ferrari forward. So they're going to be incredibly happy with Carlos Sainz. If they start getting into position to win races, that's going to be the interesting situation, because is Carlos Sainz going to play nice? And I don't think he will, and I don't think Leclerc's going to like that. So it's going to, if they get to that point where they can be in the fight to win races. I'm sorry, I've just got a cat visiting me now. Then that's going to be the interesting thing. So yeah, that's what's impressed me most, really, how Carlos Sainz has integrated and how much that's propelled Ferrari forwards as a team. So yeah.
Well, for those of you watching on YouTube, we'll be happy to know that this is DNF1's first official animal video. So hello to Tom's cat. Have to have them on in a future episode, of course, just to keep it running. But Courtney, of course, he's back. There he goes. Is it like the Renault cat? All of a sudden, it's made the return. What's his name, Tom?
That's Leo. He's the one that's always jumping on me.
Fair enough. Well, it might be a good luck charm for McLaren. I have to see how I get on this weekend. But
hopefully.
I hope not, but you never know. But cats aren't traditionally lucky, but I'm going to let that one have its moment, and then we'll have to wait and see on the review how that works out. But Courtney, of course, got to bring you into this one as well. McLaren versus Ferrari. It's been neck and neck for different reasons. Lando Norris, of course, the shining star for McLaren. And in a way, as a Ferrari fan, I'd kind of hope that Lando was responsible for arranging his own travel arrangements, because if it was up to Lando, instead of being at France, owing to his geography skills, for anyone who watched the Grill the Grid this week, will know that Lando most likely end up at Dublin Airport rather than in France. I don't know if either of you saw that.
No, I didn't.
Sorry.
No, I didn't. I confess I didn't see that. Go on. Sorry, Courtney.
I think like you look at Lando, I think he's been fantastic. And I think he's really going to do well in these coming circuits. I do think Ferrari are going to struggle compared to McLaren in these coming races. I think they're going to be solid. And I think Lando's going to continue with his form. But I make you absolutely right about Daniel Ricciardo, Tom. He really needs to up his game, because Ferrari, they've got a really good driver lineup this year. Carlos Sainz has been impressive. I'm personally surprised by how quickly he took to Ferrari. So in terms of the partnership itself, Ferrari is strong, but I still think McLaren have a better package overall.
No, that's fair enough. I mean, Daniel Ricciardo is an important factor in this battle at the moment, because whilst Ferrari and McLaren have been head-to-head the whole way through, and probably will continue, in the fairest way I could probably put it, it's mostly been Lando Norris single-handedly fighting off the two Ferraris in this battle. So uncharacteristically, Daniel has struggled to get on terms with his car so far. Do you feel that perhaps he's trying to overcomplicate this learning process at McLaren, or do you feel that eventually he's going to figure it out, and when he does, it's going to impact in a big way? Tom, how do you see this going on with Ricciardo? Do you feel like he's overcomplicating this process?
I think the car's overcomplicated, and it's something that Carlos Sainz has alluded to in interviews as well. And he even said to Ricciardo, "What do you think of the McLaren? It's weird, isn't it?" So there's obviously something strange about that car that Norris has got on top of, and Ricciardo hasn't. I did have it explained to me by a tech guru exactly what that is. I confess I can't remember all the details, but it was way above my head. It's something to do with like slip angles and the way that Lando likes to drive, and that obviously F1 cars are always sliding anyway. That's how they get the best times. But Ricciardo likes a much more pointy front end, like Verstappen does, and he likes to be braking hard and turning into the corners, whereas Lando is much more sliding through the corners. So he just needs to get on top of that. And I don't think it's ever really the way it is at the moment. I don't think it's ever really going to match his current driving style. But the best drivers are the ones that adapt. And Hamilton, when he first came into Formula One, really struggled with tyres, and now he's one of the best at managing tyres. So if Ricciardo wants to be considered a world champion, he's driven for more teams than any driver on the current grid, or the same amount of teams as any other driver on the grid. I think Perez is the only one that's driven for as many teams as him. So he needs to prove that he's not a journeyman and that he is actually world championship credential, because he's only been able to convert wins in one car. So he needs to prove that when he has the machinery, he can deliver, because currently he's not doing that. I think Norris is being complimented a little bit this season. And again, don't get me wrong, I love Lando. He's my boy. He's my favourite driver. But Carlos Sainz in that McLaren. McLaren are clearly third in the championship, and Lando and Carlos are on a similar number of points. I don't think Lando is particularly. He hasn't made the giant leap this year. He's definitely more mature and he's looking the more complete driver, but he's not a huge amount higher than he was last year. It's just more that Ricciardo isn't as good as Carlos Sainz was last year right now. So I think that's the difference right now.
I can tell Leo is absolutely dying to cast his opinion on this podcast, from what I can see.
He's a very needy little flower, is our Leo.
Yeah, for those of you obviously listening to this on Spotify or Google Play or etc., yeah, Tom's cat Leo is certainly having a ball with his setup at the moment as he comes back onto screen again. Yeah, if he's got an opinion, Tom, let him weigh in if he's got a take on McLaren this season and what they expect to do.
Anything to say, Leo? Nah, he's lost his voice.
Well, I'm no Dr. Dolittle, so I'm just going to say McLaren are looking strong, judging by his reaction. Let's look at the other teams in the midfield. Now, I think we should go to Aston Martin first, given how brilliant Sebastian Vettel's Baku Grand Prix was. Courtney, how great was it seeing Seb on the podium in Aston Martin? And could this be the catalyst to an upturn in performance for not just him, but also the team as well? Because Aston Martin have been looking a bit more competitive these last few weeks.
Yeah, no, I agree. It was definitely nice to see him back, given the way that his relationship with Ferrari ended. I think he sort of went out down the trap door, didn't he, at Ferrari? Given somebody that was so formidable about 10 years ago, it's a bit sad to see, really. So it's nice to see him get a positive result with Aston Martin. But I do feel that Aston Martin benefited from the track specifics of Monaco and Baku. I don't think they're going to struggle massively, but I don't expect them to be at the higher end of the field as we saw in the last couple of races.
Yeah, and Tom, I suppose, it'd be good to get your thoughts on this as well with Seb, that you mentioned, of course, one of the good things Ferrari did last season was move Seb on. Of course, perhaps not in the manner that they did, but the fact that they've moved him onto another team to get someone like Sainz in was a good move for them. But, by contrast, do you feel that this was also a good move or a blessing in disguise for Seb as it could turn out to be? Or do you feel that perhaps this performance he put in at Baku could potentially be the height of his time at the team?
I think if you look at the start of the season, Vettel, out of his 1.5 days in the car, he got a couple of hours at best with all the problems that Aston Martin had. The season started and Lance Stroll bagged a couple of early point scores, and Vettel was still getting used to the car. And Vettel's performances have got progressively better throughout the season, whereas Lance Stroll stayed the same. He was on for a decent finish in Baku, which would have been down to the strategy. I think the strategy calls that Aston Martin have been making in the last couple of races have been key and have been very good. So they've got that going for them. They seem to be getting on top of the car slowly, and importantly, their star signing in Sebastian Vettel is getting on top of that car now as well. Lance Stroll still the same average midfield runner as he normally is. More used to the car, more used to the team, but still just being utterly average. And Vettel is now massively exceeding his teammate, and I think you're going to see more of that. Potentially not the same box office finish positions. I think he'd struggle to get on the podium again, barring strange situations. But I say how many races have we got left? Allegedly 17 races left this season. That's the whole of last season. So there's a long way still to go. So I think you'll continue to see Vettel improve. Again, maybe not second positions and podiums, but I think you'll see him in the points a lot more regularly, which is going to make the fight between Alpine and Aston Martin and AlphaTauri, and potentially even dragging Ferrari and McLaren into that fight as well. It's going to make it very interesting if Sebastian Vettel gets anywhere near back to the level he was in 2018, because that's what the last time he was peak Vettel.
I certainly hope so, because Seb it's no secret Seb's my favorite driver on the grid. I find it's a very, very much a wholesome kind of driver. I think is the best way to describe him. Very much a driver that a lot of people seem to like a lot more than they did in the past. And, that can go a long way as a driver. And I feel like Seb, in his own mind now, as for the first time, perhaps tried to shake away the demons that he had from his unceremonious exit from Ferrari, and of course the shortcomings that came from that period, which proved to be unsuccessful, if you like, the reincarnation of Schumacher as Ferrari would have hoped it would have been, but ultimately nowhere near that. Looking at this battle in particular, we've got three teams. We've got Aston Martin, Alpine, of course, reveling now from re-signing Esteban Ocon for at least until 2024, which I think we can all agree is really good news for the driver and the team. And we've also got AlphaTauri now that who put in a stellar job last weekend. The last Grand Prix must be said. Pierre Gasly getting on the podium and Yuki Tsunoda getting some big points to seventh place as well. How do we see this battle going this weekend between those three teams? Who do you think is going to come out on top? Who do you feel has work to do? And more importantly, who do you think is going to take the, if you like, fifth in the championship in the constructors out of those three teams? Courtney, how do you see this battle going between those three?
I think right now, the advantage in that tight midfield battle, because let's as we can already see, we've got another very tight midfield battle as we saw last season. And I think the difference probably right now is Pierre Gasly. I think Pierre Gasly's had another sublime start to the season, apart from a couple of mishaps. I think the current form that he's in, I think he could be the guy that makes a difference in this battle. But the other thing worth noting is Sebastian Vettel. If he carries on with this kind of form, he could make the difference for Aston Martin.
And critically as well, on the subject of Esteban Ocon, first of all, I mean, as I said, I feel that we're all happy that he's managed to sign an extension. But first of all, how important is it for Ocon to get some longevity in his Formula One future? Because he's constantly been driving, not knowing if he was going to be in the sport. But more critically, for Alpine, is that going to be a very wise move going forward?
I think he's definitely they're obviously banking him as the future of Alpine, and Fernando Alonso is supposedly the now of Alpine. So they're going to want Ocon to learn from Alonso and impart as much of his wisdom as possible, and then lead the team from there on, and then promote from their young driver academy. You've got Christian Lundgaard's, Guan Yu Zhou, who I don't rate, and you've got a couple of other people all coming through as well in the Renault academy. So I think you're going to be seeing them promoting some youngsters into that team alongside Esteban Ocon. And Ocon now, I believe that's now him severing ties completely with Mercedes, because he was always, Alpine had first refusal over him. But if they didn't want him, then Mercedes, obviously, he defaults back to them and their choice. So I think that's now him severing all ties with Mercedes, which is probably a healthy thing for his mental state, because that Mercedes young driver program is just as cutthroat as the Red Bull one. He was the golden child of that Mercedes academy. He was pretty much promised a Mercedes drive alongside Lewis Hamilton, but then they decided to re-sign Bottas because Ocon was a little bit hard to manage at times. And then George Russell has completely usurped him in the pecking order. So I think he'll be glad to have that stability now and the manufacturer backing. I just hope that Renault stick with it and keep Alpine in the sport for as long as possible, and at least for the length of that contract anyway. And I think it's good for Alpine to have that stability and have that one driver, similar to the way that Ferrari are building around Leclerc. They've got that one driver they can now focus on. He's a French driver, which is great for, we know how much the French love the patriotism and sticking with their nationalism in the sport. So that's gonna help the board that they've got a talented young French driver in the car, and it's going to buy them some time as well. So it's looking good for Alpine. They just need to get on top of the car, which is the thing that they're not quite on top of at the moment. I think when you look at it, they've probably got the strongest driver lineup out of the teams they're fighting with. You've got Pierre Gasly as a known quantity, and Yuki Tsunoda is win or bin. You've got Lance Stroll, depressingly average, and Sebastian Vettel can be amazing. And then, with Alonso and Ocon at the moment, Alonso's showing flashes of brilliance and Ocon has missed a consistency. I know Alonso's ahead of Ocon in the championship right now, but that's down to the one box office result again for Alonso. So I think they're looking strong for that fight now. I think that AlphaTauri have had potentially one of the best midfield cars in the grid all season. They They just haven't capitalised on that. So I'm looking forward to seeing what Alpine can bring to the table for the rest of the season. I think they're in a strong position, and it's going to be between probably them and Aston Martin, I reckon.
Yeah, they certainly have the most to be buoyant about. As you mentioned, the Young Driver Academy, is boasting a lot of talent. Christian Lundgaard, very good young driver. Oscar Piastri, the Formula 3 champion, of course, making headlines in F2 for all the right reasons in most cases.
He's excellent.
And I rate him very highly as well, actually, Oscar Piastri. Very impressive him last season. And of course, Guan Yu Zhou, who currently does lead the F2 championship. But like yourself, Tom, I feel that Guan Yu Zhou, for whatever reason, just doesn't impress me enough to feel like I could trust him to make that step up into Formula One. And of course, with every year, more and more younger guys coming through, that window seems to be getting smaller and smaller and smaller for him. But certainly a lot of good problems for Alpine to have, but something that they will have to face sooner rather than later. I'm just not sure that problem is going to arise when Alonso goes. I think it might come a lot sooner than that. But we mentioned AlphaTauri recently and briefly, Courtney. We did mention them. Gasly, great result he had at the Baku Grand Prix. Tsunoda, his best performance of the season, getting a 7th place. Their futures at the moment seem a bit up in the air, perhaps more Gasly than Tsunoda. Do you feel that given that Alpine now have their driver lineup in place already for next season, Aston Martin, of course, would have the same thing already with Seb and Stroll. Do you feel that this could potentially be a weakness for AlphaTauri as the season goes on, not knowing who their two drivers are going to be next season compared to Aston Martin and Alpine?
It would definitely be a factor because obviously we saw, we've seen what's happening with Valtteri Bottas, and having a stable future obviously makes a big difference in terms of your mental focus on a race weekend, and obviously you need that to do well. So it definitely play a role, but I think the main factor for AlphaTauri is the form of Yuki Tsunoda, because he hasn't been particularly great as of late, so he really does need to get going in order to help them in this tight championship battle.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Let's move on to Alfa Romeo. Now, of course, Tom, you were saying before we started recording that you never look forward to talking about Alfa Romeo, or you feel like you get landed with the Alfa Romeo question. I'm going to give you one, but not necessarily related to performance, because I think we can all agree that Alfa Romeo could potentially be there or thereabouts in the points, and they're very good at taking opportunities when they come. But ultimately, I think we all feel that they're probably the best of the back markers by some margin, and they do need a bit of fortune perhaps to try and nip at the heels of the guys in front of them. But regarding their current situation with their driver lineup, we've got Kimi Räikkönen, of course, the veteran of the sport, 2007 world champion. We never really know if it's going to be Kimi's last dance or if he's going to carry on for next season. And then we've also got Antonio Giovinazzi, who is very much driving for his Formula One career. And whilst he's doing very, very well, we can't ignore the drivers that are looking at that seat as well, the likes of Callum Ilott, of course, who narrowly missed out last season, runner-up in F2 last season, Théo Pourchaire, another driver like Oscar Piastri, impressing very much in F2, a part of the Sauber Academy. And of course, the other Ferrari drivers like Robert Schwartzman, Marcus Armstrong, and Giuliano Alesi. How do you see that situation at Alfa Romeo going forward? Do you feel that they are going to make driver changes for 2022? And if so, will either Räikkönen or Giovinazzi have their seat next season?
Well, I don't think we've got anything to worry about with Giuliano Alesi. I don't think he'll be anywhere near a Formula One drive anytime soon. But there's got to be change at Alfa Romeo. I said at the start of the season, I don't think Alfa Romeo are going to be on the grid next season in their current guys. I think you could potentially see a tie-up with Renault there. They're looking to sever ties, and Alfa Romeo, the branding doesn't look like they want to continue. They only signed a 1-year extension and then, didn't really know what they wanted to do, so they just re-signed the same drivers again. Boring. But this season, Giovinazzi is looking better. But he's better than a Kimi Räikkönen that's not been on the pace for a long time. So I've always said I need to see Giovinazzi alongside an experienced teammate in his prime to know how good he is. But I think, they are. He's got a chance of staying again. I hope that if they do keep a driver, it's him. And I hope that Räikkönen doesn't stay on again, because he's just keeping a seat of another young driver. He's not bringing anything to the sport apart from memes. So I just don't see him. I don't see a place for Formula One for him anymore. I think you've got a lot of potential in there with the Sauber young driver pro Kimi Piastri, fantastic driver. Piastri was the Alpine Academy, wasn't he?
Yeah.
there is definitely some Porsche. Sorry, that's what I meant to say. Porsche, fantastic driver, nearly won the championship last year, the F3 championship, looking phenomenal. So I hope there is change. I hope they do. If they do continue a type with Ferrari, but change the branding. I don't see a place for Callum Ilott. I don't think he's got enough backing. I think he's now looking at a sports car championship, or maybe some Extreme E or something further down the line. It's probably his way into the spotlight. I don't think he's got the backing or the overall overriding talent to be in Formula One, which is hard for me to say as a patriotic Brit. But that's how I see it. I think you've got some possibilities there with the Ferrari Young Driver program if they do continue with that, to get people like Schwartzman in, who's now back in the fight in F2 after a mediocre start. I highly rate him. I think he's the best chance. He's going to be the next Formula One driver to come in through the Ferrari banner. But yeah, it's a difficult situation for Alfa Romeo. They need to get their future sorted out. They need to either get rid of Alfa Romeo or get a commitment from them, because if they're not sticking around, they need to know so that they can plan for next year. If we're getting Sauber back on the grid next year, great, I'm all for it. But they need some serious backing. So if they need serious backing, that's going to mean drivers with backing, pay drivers, and we're going back to the Manisha Kaltenborn days of Sauber, where they're at the back of the grid trying to just get the odds great box office result. So though we don't really want to see that, they are definitely the ahead of the Williams and the Haas right now. But yeah, we just want to see Sauber do well. But Alfa Romeo, I'm certainly not particularly bothered.
Yeah, no, I certainly remember those days as well, and not so fondly. But one driver they did unearth was Kimi Räikkönen. Of course, Courtney, you've been very much an advocate for Kimi this season out of the two Alfa Romeo drivers. Do you feel or agree with what Tom's saying in terms of the fact that perhaps Kimi is just holding on to a seat now that could be passed on to someone else? Or do you feel that he still has some value to add into Formula One, despite the fact that he's so famously referred to F1 as just a hobby at this point in his life?
Yeah, I do also believe this will probably be his last season. I think the big question is, will they keep Giovinazzi or will they go with a whole new team next season? I think I'd be very surprised if Kimi's there next season, because he has made it pretty clear that he's only there for the money. He's just there for the day job. Can't blame him really for feeling that way. But as Tom's already stated, you're holding up a seat for, the way that the junior categories are looking are so strong. And it is a shame to see some of these drivers missing out on a seat in Formula One. I think we're getting to a point now in Formula One, as tough as, obviously the financial situation is worldwide. I think given the situation we've got with these younger drivers coming through, I think we need another team or maybe two to give these guys a chance, because at the end of the day, as Formula One fans, you want to be seeing the best facing the best. And right now, we're not seeing that. So I think this will be Kimi's last season. The big question is, will Giovinazzi be at Alfa Romeo next season, or will he be leaving as well?
Yeah, we'll certainly have to wait and see to find out. I think we've got Williams and Haas now to talk about briefly. Williams, I don't really feel that there's much that we can say on Williams as a team that we haven't already said on this podcast. I mean, it's quite deflating for them given the direction they went with design on the car. Very much seems to be a view of hopefully next year will be better. And with the regulation reset, we all certainly hope. I certainly hope that will be the case. But one figure I think is always worth talking about is George Russell. And with the rumours, of course, now intensifying that Mercedes will be his destination next season, is there anything more that Russell can do realistically to convince Mercedes that he is the appropriate teammate for Lewis Hamilton? Tom, I've got to ask for your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, quite frankly, he needs to score a point. It's a huge question mark over there at the moment. I know, like you can say about the Sakir race and he proved what he can do, but when he's pushing that car to the limit, he's never got that box office position. There's always been something that's got in the way. I mean, I partially blame him for the Bottas collision, and then obviously the previous year in Imola looking the 50-50 chance for points, and he's been there. He's other times as well this season. He's not quite pulled it off. Because of Schumacher's 13th place in the last race, that's now put Schumacher ahead of Russell in the championship. George Russell's got 3 14th place finishes, which puts him ahead of Nikita Mazepin. So he needs he needs at the very least, he needs an 11th or 12th place to put himself ahead of Mick Schumacher. Because if he's not beat, I know it's just down to 0 points, but he needs points or needs to be ahead of the rest of those guys. I don't think it's going to make a huge difference to Mercedes, but certainly to his doubters, that's gonna just absolutely put an end to any of the debate. If he's the only driver that can score points in those 4 cars, then it's an absolute no-brainer, and he needs to do that just to rubber stamp it. If they've got any doubt whether Russell is the real deal and Bottas picks up his pace, they'll stick with Bottas, because that's what Mercedes do. They go for the conservative option. If Bottas isn't delivering the goods anymore and George Russell was clearly outperforming the car, then they'll go for that, and they'll just deal with the inner team politics when they get to it. But the first most important thing is they need good drivers in that car, and if Russell can prove that he is head and shoulders above the rest of those guys around him, and grab a point, or at least an 11th place in a strong position, finishing ahead of cars that he should be behind, then that's what he needs to do. Williams just need to get some consistency now, because they've obviously parted company with Simon Roberts, and they've got the guy whose name eludes me, but they refer to him as FX, something Xavier, but he's now in charge, so it's still going to be a building year for them. They might get that odd great result this year, given that the aero setup they've gone for this year, going for win or bust, so they may get a good result this year if the track situation suits. But I think they were kind of pinning their hopes on a Singapore or a Monaco to get that result, and obviously Singapore's not happening and Monaco didn't work out, so it's going to be a long season for them. They have to finish ahead of Haas, or all of the good work that's been done at Williams will just be for nothing, and they're going to be losing George Russell next year. I think whatever happens, whether he's at Mercedes, or they loan him out to another team, like maybe an Alfa Romeo or something like that, just to get slightly further up the grid. I can see that as a possibility as well. But he'll be out of that team next year, so he needs to prove that they're on an upward curve to attract something like a Sergio Perez, who's not had his contract renewed, or a Nico Hulkenberg, who's found a decent amount of backing and wants one last shot at it, that kind of thing. They need to attract a driver like that. They can't go for another Sergei Sorokin or something like that. They need someone who's got talent, who's going to bring that car forwards.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And of course, as you pointed out, Mick Schumacher's 13th place not only gets him ahead of George Russell in the Drivers' Championship, but critically moves Haas ahead of Williams, which of course is a huge, huge issue for them, given that Haas have literally done next to no development on their car. So that could prove to be huge at the end of the season. Courtney, anything you want to add on the Russell situation? Perhaps anything new that we haven't already discussed in previous episodes? Or do you feel that he does need to get a point in order to convince Mercedes he's good enough?
I think he really needs to keep the races as clean as possible, because whenever we're seeing the multiple cars falter ahead of him, but that's going to be his best chance given how bad Williams are at the moment. He always just seems to have some kind of minor tangle or a problem with the car that hinders him. So he really does need to maybe just be a little bit more reserved, keep the car in a good place, and then when these kind of situations happen, because they can happen out of nowhere. Formula One is sometimes, very much luck can come into it. I think if he used to be a little bit more reserved with how he looks after the car, then he might be able to pounce when these kind of opportunities arise.
No, fair point. We'll briefly talk about Haas. We won't talk about he who shall not be named, I'm imagining a situation he's going to be driving around this Grand Prix, seeing all of the blue and red markings all around the outskirts of the circuit, and give himself a migraine because he's going to be spinning around, and that it's kind of got the hypnosis effect going on or something like that. We haven't even talked about that sort of the outskirts of the circuit being all the different grip levels or something like that. I've seen some weird Grand Prix designs before, but that one is certainly one that gives me a migraine every time I look at photos of it. But Tom, I do want to get your thoughts on Mick Schumacher. What have you made of Mick Schumacher so far this season? Because there's obviously been a lot of hype around Mick being the son of the 7-time world champion Michael Schumacher, and of course his success in junior category in F3 and F2, particularly as a result of his ability to adapt and learn, and of course eventually become very consistent in his performances, hence why he's in Formula One. Have you been impressed with Mick Schumacher so far, and how far do you feel he can go?
I have been impressed, actually. I wasn't his biggest fan in his first year in F2. I saw him as another nepotism project of trying to bring people into Formula One of famous fathers, and I just that was a little bit of bias, and also part of me having you're not going to like this, Adam, but part of me having sat through the Ferrari dominance, I wasn't ready for a Schumacher back in Formula One at that point. But as it was, he really impressed me in Formula 2 last year, and I don't get me wrong, I don't think he'll ever be world champion. I think given the right situation, he'll probably end up in a Ferrari at some point, which means he'll probably win races. And he's definitely equipped himself very well and shown himself to be a quality driver and shown himself to be there on merit. He absolutely deserves his chance in Formula One, which is more than what we can say about his teammate, who I apologise for naming earlier. I think he's definitely got the chance, as I said, of doing something, just not in that car. So it just depends on what the direction of that team is. I know he does not get on with his teammate. He never has. The sooner he's out of that car, the better it is for his career. But he just needs to keep his head down, keep putting in the results. He's got that one result at the moment. If he remains in 17th at the end of the season, that is a phenomenal achievement for him and better than he could have ever really hoped for. If you can get some points at some point, in like a rain-soaked Brazil or something like that, then great, more power to him. It'd be fantastic to see that. But I don't think it's going to happen. But yeah, that's it's just a case of just how long can he. Is he going to be in that car, and when is he going to be in a better car? Because I want to see that. I want to see. I don't think we'll certainly see a win for him, but it'd be nice to see the Schumacher name back up on the top of the time sheets at some point anyway. And it hurts for me to say that, but I've become a bit more of a bit more appreciative of the Schumacher years in my older years now. So I think it'd be a good thing for Formula One to see him further up the field anyway.
No, that's fair enough. And I think, I'm being mindful of the time here, but I'm going to ask you guys quickly for your predictions for this race. So what I would like from each of you is who you think is going to get on pole position, who's going to be your top three for the race, and one bold prediction for the Grand Prix. Tom, I will start with you first.
Oh, I didn't know you were going to ask me this, so I'm going to do this on the fly. Okay, so I think Lewis Hamilton's going to get on pole. I think that Mercedes is going to be back on top, and Hamilton's going to drag it out. I don't think he's going to win the race. I think it's going to be a Max Verstappen win. And the cat is back. Go away. And a bold prediction you wanted, didn't you?
Yes, please.
I will go with. There's going to be a driver who's currently on no points that's going to be on points at the end of this race, because potentially rain.
Okay.
Potentially. I mean, it looks like it's going to be raining in the morning, but it generally kind of drags away. So later on through the day, as the week goes on, so I'm hoping we'll get a little smattering of rain, and somebody who currently has no points will sneak into the points, and hopefully that's either George Russell or Mick Schumacher.
And how about you, Courtney? Pole position, top three, and your bold prediction.
So I'm going to go with a traditional Max Verstappen pole, but I think Lewis is going to have the stronger race pace. So I think Lewis is going to get the win. But in terms of a bold prediction, I think we could see another strong performance by Sebastian Vettel. I think he could get himself a good haul of points. So we'll see how that one goes.
Okay, no, fair enough. That's a good prediction. I am going to go probably a bit more reverting to type on this one. I am going to go with a Lewis Hamilton pole. I feel like Lewis has been due one. So it's been a few races now. It's not like Lewis to not get pole position. So I'll back him for that. I'm also going to back Lewis to win the race. I feel like this could be a track that Mercedes are going to be strong at. And I feel like Lewis definitely will be up for this one. And I think this will suit him a little bit better. So I'm going to go with him for the win. Max in second place. And I'm going to go with Lando Norris in P3. I think McLaren and Ferrari are going to be battling, particularly Leclerc and Norris. And I think Norris is going to have the upper hand at this race. Will be his third podium of the season, I think it will be. So that'd be a great shout for him. My bold prediction, this is going to be a tough one, but I am going to go with... this is really hard, isn't it? To try and come up with something a bit original that hasn't been done already. I would say 7 points, but he's done it a few times now. It's more expected. No, I am going to go with screw it, George Russell to get a point. Why not? If it's going to rain, why not? George Russell to get a point.
Excellent.
Right.
That would be nice.
It would be very nice indeed. And obviously, if he does, that Mercedes contract just comes in through the post the very next day, based on what we claim George needs to do to secure that deal for next season. But of course, that is plenty of time to go over that in the future. But before we do sign off, as always, if you have enjoyed this episode of the podcast, make sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, to join our DNF1 family. There's always room for new members, and we hope that keeps growing and growing. And of course, if you are following us on your favorite podcasting platform, thank you so much for listening in. And of course, we hope you enjoyed it. Tom, before we sign off for this week's episode, could you care to let our viewers and listeners know where they can find you if they want to hear your voice and of course Leo's input a little bit more?
Well, after you finish listening to this and subscribe to this, then you need to go to @MonkeySeatPod, and that's on all the socials. We've got website, monkeyseatpod.com, and if you want to get in touch with us, it's monkeyseatpodcast@gmail.com. And so we talk about all formulas. We cover Formula 2, Formula 3. We're going to be covering W Series. We have Extreme E and various interviews with people as well across the way. Anyone we can beg to come on and talk to us, we do tend to have on. So yeah, lots of content there.
Well, a long story short, guys, if you can race it, Tom's bound to be talking about it on his podcast. So you certainly spoiled for content there as far as motorsport is concerned. So no, great effort there. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Tom. As always, it's been a pleasure having you on. And until then, guys, make sure you stay safe. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. Take care.
See you soon.